questions other than the purpose statement that we can answer before we get going? Okay, so hopefully you've had time to watch Dr. Berkey's lecture from last week, which was the YouTube link, and because she's a qualitative researcher, so almost all the research she does is qualitative, and occasionally she'll do a mixed methods. So it was much better for her to talk to you about that than me, because I've never done any qualitative research in my life. I am strongly quantitative. So what I want to do today is try to give you some of the language that you're going to see in quantitative research. Make sure that you're understanding that. Again, have a quick look at the differences between quantitative and qualitative. They're both empirical forms of research. So they both collect original data. It's just the type of data that we're looking at, and the methodology is very, very different. And where you have to put your time in is very, very different, depending on whether it's quantitative or qualitative. Okay? So let me pull up this PowerPoint. Can't believe we're week 6 already. That's a bit disturbing. Okay. All right. So, you might remember Dr. Berkey saying when you're doing qualitative research, that what you're looking for is a lot of verbiage, right? A lot of language. The data that you're collecting is interviews. It might be a particular kind of survey, but it's all about language. How do you feel about something? What do you think about this idea? All right? When we look at quantitative research, we're looking at numerical data. Okay? So the data that we're collecting is strongly numerical. Even if it's a survey, what you'll find is that the survey has a numerical score attached to it. So the questions, obviously, are language, but those answers that you give are translated into a numerical piece of data. Okay? So it's not that you can't do quantitative research using a survey. It's just the kind of answers, the kind of data you're getting out of it is numerical rather than language-based. All right? So in quantitative, a lot of the work goes into the planning for the data collection. All right? Because it's very important that we control for many different kinds of variables. And so you often will see a pre-study. So you might see what they call a pilot study, because sometimes if it's going to cost a lot of money, or if it's going to take a lot of people, you might want to run a smaller version of the study, test out your methodology and see what kinds of data you get before you run the full-blown thing, because of this control issue. All right? So we have to control for the participants as best we can, and I'll talk to you a bit more about that in a minute. We have to do our best to control the environment and the task. So if we are looking at a specific task, it has to stay consistent throughout the data collection. The environment, as best you can, you know, so if you're doing a study that's indoors in the gym, you're well off. If you're doing a study that's outdoors on the playground, you've got to do a little bit of this and hope that the weather cooperates for you, right? And obviously, we can't control for everything. And so in a quantitative paper, you'll often see at the end of the discussion, there'll be a paragraph that's talking about the limitations of this study were. All right? Because that's important that we own those limitations. You can't just kind of try to sweep them under the carpet. All right? And what we're looking for when we run our analysis and we get our results is a way to be able to predict that something can happen relatively often, right? This is, if I do this, I'm going to see this, right? Or a cause and effect that's a little bit tighter, right? That when I have this effect, this is what caused it, right? In qualitative, they're not looking for that kind of clarity, okay? They're much more looking about what's the overall picture of what people are saying to us, okay? And you'll often see the participants split into groups in quantitative studies. And so then you want to be looking at how are they comparing the groups, all right? So I can compare between groups. I have group A, I have group B, I run 2 different interventions, and at the end of the intervention, I compare how much improved group A is and how much improved group B is. And I compare the 2 groups, and that gives me an idea about which intervention is the most useful. All right? So that would be a between subjects analysis. But we can also do a within subjects analysis. So I can take group A and look at their pre-test scores and look at their post-test scores and see how much that group individually improved over the course of one intervention. And that's a within subjects analysis. All right? So oftentimes you'll see that terminology in the paper, but not always. So you need to be able to just kind of identify, oh, yeah, okay, they're looking at only between subjects, or they're looking at only within subjects. They're not comparing the 2 different interventions. They're just seeing how much improvement they get from each intervention, right? So it's just a slightly different perspective on the data, really. Okay, so your participants then, how do I get my participant pool is an important question for quantitative people, all right? Because that sampling can impact the legitimacy of the results, okay? So our favorite is a random sample, all right? I can just pick, 200-300 people from all over the place, different ages, different, right? And that would be great. And if I have a random sample and I get a result, then I can infer that result onto a different group of people because I had a random sample. As long as the sample was large enough. I mean, if I have 10, and they were random, that doesn't count, right? It's got to be a big sample. But that's pretty difficult to pull off, right? It's a great idea. It's theoretically the best way to put your population together, but it's actually quite hard to do. So we sometimes kind of resort to other ways of sampling our population. So you'll see the term purposive or stratified sometimes. So that means that they've taken a large sample, may or may not be random, and they've divided it. Anyone who's over 50 is in that group, and anyone under 50 is in this group, for example. You'll sometimes see them say, we did systematic sampling. So we sat outside the student dining hall, and every 10th person who walked through the door, we asked them if they would volunteer for the study. Right? Or, the one that I always end up resorting to is a convenience sample. All right? Can sometimes be called a volunteer sample. So we often see convenience samples in movement research just because getting a random sample, as I said, is very difficult. Movement research tends to take a lot of time. It's not like chemistry where you can go to the lab for one day and create enough data for 4 different papers. You know, if I'm going to run an intervention from a movement or a physiology perspective, then that takes weeks and weeks and weeks of intervention before I can run a post-test. All right? So a convenience sample then means that I went to the local high school and I asked all the seniors if they would volunteer for my study. Right? So it's a convenient sample because they're all in one place at one time. Okay? In my case, my preschool and toddler research is convenient sample, and it's relatively small population, which I get told off about all the time, but I can't create preschoolers. Right? If I go to the childcare center and they have 10 children, then I only have 10 children to do my research on. And that's if all 10 parents signed off the form. Right? So that's a convenient sample. So a convenient sample is useful, convenient, obviously, from a data collection perspective. The problem is that when you get your results, you now cannot generalize those results to another population. So if I run a study, well, I did run a study, so I ran a study on little black children in Alabama, right? And they're all in the same childcare center, and they all come from the same town. The results that I get from that study cannot be generalized to a Hispanic preschool population living in New Mexico, right? It's fair to say that the chances of the results being similar is quite good, but I can't generalize. I have to go to New Mexico, find the Hispanic population, and run the research all over again. That has pros and cons, gives me another research paper with not a lot more work, right? Because I've already done all the work for the literature review on the first time, right? But it sometimes feels a bit like I'm reinventing the wheel here. Why am I doing this, right? Any questions so far? No? Okay, just yell at me. If you have a question, just turn your mic on and yell, okay? So, I wanted to point this out because we use the same word in 2 different instances, and that can get confusing. So on the previous slide, we were talking about having a random sample, and that meant that I had lots of different types of individuals from all over the place, right? Here, I'm talking about random assignment into groups. Okay? So once I've got my sample, how do I put them into group A, group B, group C? Right? So the best way of doing that is randomly, okay? Because we need to be able to say, oh, I didn't know that there were 3 people who all ran a marathon last year in this group, right? Because I divided them up by tossing a coin, okay? You can get sophisticated computer programs to randomize your sample for you, but it's just as easy to toss a coin or put everybody into a hat and then pull them out and put them in a pile, right? That's just as acceptable, okay? So we're going to divide this group up without knowing who's going into which group, kind of thing, right? The other thing you want to watch for, particularly if you're looking at exercise physiology papers, so anything to do with training programs, okay? This comes up a lot, and it's really important that they mention it, right? Is the idea of matched pairs, okay? So matched pairs helps you to balance the capabilities of your 2 groups, all right? Because when we're looking at physiology and at training adaptations, I don't get to control someone's physiology, right? So if I have all the type 1 fiber people in one group and all the type 2 fiber people in another group, and I'm doing a power intervention, then the first group is not going to do very well, right? That's bad research, okay? That don't get published, all right? So what we want to do, and as I said, particularly if you're looking at ex-phys type papers, you want to look for this idea of matching the pairs. So what they do is they pre-test the population, and then they take, let me see, maybe if I do this on the whiteboard, this will make a little more sense than me just talking about it. Okay, so we test the whole population, right? And let's say we're doing strength, all right? So we take the strongest and the second strongest. So we've got group A, and over here we've got group B. I'm getting better at manipulating this whiteboard, all right? And I put number 1 in here, and I put number 2 in there, all right? And after that, I take number 3 and number 4, but I flip a coin. So number 3 may not end up in here, number 4 may end up in here, and number 3 may end up over here, right? And then I take number 5 and number 6, and I flip a coin. And number 5 ends up over here, and number 6 ends up over here. Okay? And I continue on until I've split the whole sample up into the 2 groups. Does that make sense? Because this is an important idea. You need to be looking for this because it distinguishes good research from poor research, right? Make sense, Christina? Yeah? Okay, good.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, so if I do matched pairs, it's a version of random assignment because I'm flipping the coin between the next two people who are the most alike, right? But it means that I end up with two groups that are well balanced on capability, or rather on ability, and that means that when I run the intervention, I don't have this uneven allocation of people who are strong and people who are weak, or people who are fast and people who are slow. Okay? Okay, so I think I talked about variables earlier in the semester, but I want to go over them again because they relate to your purpose statement. All right? So when you are looking to put your purpose statement together, as a master's level student, I would encourage you to have one dependent variable and one, at most, two independent variables. All right? Because the more variables you add into the study, the more complicated the study becomes. Okay? The dependent variable, as a reminder, is your variable of interest. Right? So my dependent variable is strength, and my independent variable is the thing that I'm manipulating. So that's going to be training program. Okay? Now, back to the whiteboard. I'm so used to scribbling on the board up here, it's so weird having to do it over on the computer. All right, so my dependent variable equals strength, right? My independent variable is training program. Okay? But you probably are going to have more than one training program. I mean, not probably, but more often than not, there's going to be more than one training program and you're comparing them. Okay? So I might have a HIP program. I might have an old-fashioned weight program, and I might have a body weight program, right? So, an error I sometimes see, particularly when we get to the point of doing the presentations, because that's when you start talking about what you've done, right? Is you say, oh, my DV is strength, and I have 3 independent variables. I have a HIP program, I have a body weight program, and I have an old-fashioned weight program. That's not correct, right? You have one independent variable, but you have 3 levels of that variable. Okay? Okay, design we've talked a little bit about because it was one of the boxes on the template, the summary template, and I said it's probably the hardest box on the template. And when you write your annotated bibliographies after midterm, you are not going to highlight the design. All right? The reason I add it in earlier on is to try to get you thinking about it, because you should be able, as graduate students, to read a research paper and identify the design. Right? It's not that you necessarily write it in your abstract or in your summary, but you should be able to identify what it is. Okay? So I had it on that original template to get you practicing looking for that idea. All right? In quantitative papers, you might see the design as independent groups. It's often repeated measures because we pre-test and then we post-test and then we compare the two. So repeated measures or a pre-post design is a frequent thing you'll see. It could be a crossover or a mixed methods design. So it does some quantitative and some qualitative. It could be a pilot study. As I say, it's often a good idea to run a pilot study to check out your methodology first, especially if you're going to be using hundreds of people or you're going to be using something that costs a lot of money, right? Because you don't want to do that huge big study and then find out that your methodology was flawed and you can't get it published. It doesn't count for anything, right? You might see an observational study. So again, we can collect numerical data observationally. So I can sit in the corner of the gym and I have a rubric that says on task or off task, right? And so I'm checking how many minutes a child is on task at a particular station. Right? So I end up with numerical data. So even though it's observational, it can still be quantitative. Right? It could be a survey study. Right? So those are all the kinds of words that would describe the design of the study. Remember, the design is really looking at the plan for the data collection. Right? Remember I said at the beginning that most of the time is spent in the planning on a quantitative paper. Now on a qualitative paper, that's different. They don't plan anything. They literally don't plan. It drives me nuts. I don't know how they can even change their research question once they've started collecting data. It's bizarre. I don't understand it. Right? So they don't do any planning. They just jump the hell on in there, right? But they get reams and reams and reams of data. They've got tape recordings, they've got notebooks, and they have to sit down and go through all of that to create their themes. So in a qualitative study, it's really easy up front, but it is a pig once you've got the data in, right, to do the analysis and get your results. In a quantitative study, you've got to do all the work in the planning, the designing, the control factor to get that methodology valid. But once I've got my data, all I have to do is shove it into SPSS, press a couple of buttons, and then discuss the answers. Right? So it's not that one is easier or harder than the other, it's just that where the workload is in the study is totally, totally different. Right? Oh, was that my last one? Oh, look at that, that was quick. Okay, then, to help you out a little bit, up on Blackboard, I believe it should be in this week's folder. If it isn't there, let me know. There's a document there that is a table from a different textbook that gives you a column for qualitative and a column for quantitative, and it's giving you direct comparisons between a qualitative study and a quantitative study. So it looks at the type of language you're going to hear, it looks at key concepts, it looks at maybe the goals of the purpose, it looks at the kinds of instruments and tools you would use, the data analysis you would use, what kind of data you're going to get, those kinds of things. So it's a really simple kind of quick glance table to help you out deciding, is this qualitative, is this quantitative, right? Now, when you're doing your purpose statement, it's really important not to worry about whether or not it's qualitative or quantitative, right? Step one, get your question, right? Then we can decide if you were going to run this study, would you run it as a qualitative study or a quantitative study? Okay? Don't go into trying to think of what your question is, worrying about which type of study it is. Okay. Bless you.
Thank you.
You know, a lot of you probably are not going to go thesis route. Hopefully one or two of you will go thesis route. Because it's fun as a faculty member to work with someone who's very motivated to do an actual study, right? So I'm hoping that one or two of you do. But don't be thinking about that with the purpose, all right? So just to review the idea of purpose, you're looking for answering a question that hasn't been answered. So you're looking to plug a hole in the literature, all right? That does not mean that it has to be a brand new idea, although if you have a brand new idea, that's lovely, right? If you have an idea, you have a question, and you can't find anything about it, that's where I ended up with my dissertation. It was the most fun, because I had to pull information from so many different areas of research to put together an argument for why my question was important, right? But you don't have to do that. It doesn't have to be novel. It just has to plug the hole. So, I was saying to Yesenia earlier today, right? There's a lot of research on male athletes. There's not so much research on female athletes unless you're looking at knee injuries, because female athletes get a lot more knee injuries than males do, right? So you could look and look and look, and you've got this great question, and then you find 3 papers that tell you the answer to the question. And then you're like bummed because now I have to start again. Well, not necessarily, right? You might not have to start again. Which populations did they use, right? Were they all Olympic athletes or professional athletes? Or were they all college students and they didn't look at high school students? Or were they all men and they didn't look at women, right? So it doesn't have to be novel. It doesn't have to be a brand new idea. It just has to be something that we don't have the answer to. So that means that it's really important that you do your literature search very thoroughly. So use Google Scholar or use the library databases. If you haven't watched it, I highly recommend that you watch Karen Nilsson's lecture on the library resources. She has created a whole HPE research page for us that has lots of really good items. I think I put the link in that week's Week 3's folder to that page. Did I?
Yes, you did.
Oh, yes. Glad I remembered to do something, right? So there's tons of resources. You can call Karen or email Karen and say, I'm really interested in this, but it doesn't matter what I type into the database, I don't get it. I get things about mice, right? And she'll know exactly the right word to type in to get what you want. Don't ask me that, because I'm really bad at it. Karen's your resource for that, right? Use your resources. Don't try to do it on your own, right? We're not throwing you out to the sharks. We're here to support you and help you become better researchers and better graduate students. Because even if you don't complete the research, you still have to read research for the next 2 years, right? You've got to know how to read it, how to summarize it, how to synthesize it into your own work. That's what being a grad student is about, right? It's very different from a lot of undergrad programs, certainly our undergrad program. Okay, so just use your resources, all right? I also suggest, from my own experience, that you set a timer once you get into the databases, because you can lose all track. Right? You would not believe the stuff there is research on. And the more you dig, the more fascinating it gets, and the more tangents you go off on. And then you look up at the clock and it's like 3 hours later, right? Don't do that. Okay? I was a full-time grad student. It didn't matter if I spent 3 hours in the database, but most of you guys are not. You've got jobs or children or other things to do, right? So set a timer and say, okay, I'm going to give myself half an hour looking for a new research paper. Okay? Then, the purpose of this study is, right? If you're not sure whether it's a research question or a purpose statement, ask me. Getting some feedback. That's weird. Let me move further away, maybe that's the problem. I lost my train of thought. Oh yes, research question versus purpose statement. Ask me, because that will depend a little bit. If it's a qualitative study, they don't always have a purpose statement in the way that we've been thinking about it. You know, the purpose of this study was to, right? So check in with me if you're not sure. Remember that HPE format is double-spaced. Right? You're going to put your purpose statement, and then you're going to put your 2 references. HPE formatting. All right? You can put more than 2 if you want to. If you've already found 4 or 5 papers and you want to try them all out, put them in there and I'll pick the 2 that score the strongest, right? And if they all score full points, yay! Right? Then you've got a head start for your annobibs. Okay? So I believe your purpose questions and references are due the 5th of October. Please double check. I haven't got it here. Yes? Good.
Yeah.
You've got next week. You don't have to hand anything in next week, so you can just play in the databases, and you can, if you want to send me a draft, I can give you some feedback on it. All right? If you're struggling for a question, email me, and we can have a chat. Okay? It's important that you take the time to really check the pool of literature available so that you are not spending time asking a question we have the answer to. Okay? Because we've got a week and a half here, And if you don't send me a draft and you send in your final copy and I read it and go, well, I have a paper that answers that, then we just wasted a week and a half. All right? So do that literature search very thoroughly. Okay? What else? I have not started article number 4 yet. I'm hoping to get started on it tomorrow. Depending how tomorrow goes, that could come back tomorrow, it might come back Saturday. Hopefully it was a little less painful than number 3. I know number 3 was hard. It was hard. So don't get all stressed out because number 3 was so difficult, right? I wanted to show you that sometimes doing a summary is not just a piece of cake, right? That it can get quite tricky depending on the kind of paper you're summarizing, right? What else? I can't think. Anybody got questions for me? Let's get rid of that so I can see all your little smiley faces. Oh, I can only see Christina's little smiley face. Hi, Christina.
I do have to say that the table that you gave us is a lot.
Good.
That helped me out tremendously, so thank you for that.
Good, good. And then when we do the statistics lecture, I have some more tables that really simplify. Like if you've never taken a stats class, just follow the rules on the sheet and it will answer the question for you. So that's a real gem, that one.
Okay.
So, anybody got problems with coming up with a question at the moment? No?
Not yet.
Okay. Blimey, that was quick. Now look, Coach Walser's going to join us. Thomas is going to join us and we're going to be going away. Yeah, just remember that the midterm grade, God, we've got a week till midterms already. I don't know where it's going. Midterm grade will be based on your summary papers and the purpose, and that's it. All the other grade for this class is in the second half of the semester, by which time hopefully you're kind of getting on a roll and you feel a bit more comfortable with the material, and you'll be reading papers that you're interested in, not papers that I'm shoving down your throat. So that always helps. It's nothing worse than having to read a research paper you have no interest in whatsoever. So, okay. Well, if no one has anything for me, I can go home and pour a glass of wine. Ha ha!
There you go.
It's that time.
It is.
It is that time. So remember, so here's the thing though, right? If you have a technical question, put it into the discussion board so that I can answer it and everybody can get the benefit of that information. Obviously, if you have a more personal question like I need an extension or I'm completely stuck, I don't know what to do, put that in a regular email, but you know, use that discussion board to help each other out a little bit. Okay?
Yes, ma'am.
All right.